I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. And just to remind you that this is a learning community conversation, meaning that hopefully we are going to talk about this and we're really going to share our personal experience, our professional experience, because of course you're the experts of your experience. And as you know, this is a conversation about cultural competence, a journey toward better outcomes. Okay, so just keeping that in mind. Now, I want, before we take care of any of the sort of logistical things, and many of you have already wonderfully typed your names in the chat, which is wonderful. And again, I'll formally ask you to do that in a minute. I would like to make a couple of personal disclosures. And I feel that it's relevant to make these disclosures given the nature of the conversation that we're having. The first disclosure I want to make is, and you can probably assume this, or you've assumed this already, I'm of European descent. And because I am of European descent, I am aware that I have something within our particular society called white skin privilege. And basically what that means is that I have benefited and continue to benefit from structural racism. I am also a sex at birth male. My gender identity is male. I have what's called cisgender privilege, where I don't have to really think about my gender or my gender identity. I am also from a family with a history of substance abuse on both sides of my family. And this year, I will be 60 years alive. So I just wanted to, thank you, Nova. Thank you, Kirk. Yes, God willing, I will be 60 years alive. And I'll just say one other thing about my socioeconomic status, which is that I am fortunate enough, given my current position, to be able to work from home. And I also have been fortunate enough to be able to go to college and attain a master's degree. So I just wanted to make those disclosures before we go into this particular conversation. And we'll touch back on my disclosures in a bit, but I just wanted to share that with you at the beginning. All right. Oh, and thank you so much, Tara. Excellent. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we will take care of just some logistical pieces first. Again, cultural competence, part 1, a journey to improved outcomes. Again, there's one word that I really want to focus on in terms of this title, and that word is journey. And again, as we jump into this conversation, I'll say more about that. As you can see here from the slide, I am a senior staff trainer and curriculum developer for the Northeast and Caribbean Addiction Technology Transfer Center. I also have the opportunity to be a research project director at the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and I'm also a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers. I'm a social worker by training, and I began my social service career in 1991, providing direct services to people living with HIV and AIDS. As we engage in this learning community conversation, it's important for us to be aware of the fact that the words we're using have impact, and they have impact on those of us that are in this learning community in sharing those words. So again, words have power. We want to make sure that we are putting people first and that we are intentionally choosing to use language that is inclusive and respectful of the diversity within our learning community today and for part 2. 2 disclaimers. I'll start with the bottom one first, which is that this 4-hour presentation is actually drawn from an 18-hour course that I had the opportunity to do a training of trainers in, and I've had the opportunity to deliver the 18 hours a few times. So just keeping in mind that we are not going to cover everything that 18-hour course would have covered. I have intentionally put together the things that we will cover so that they will hopefully support our learning community conversation. And to that end, what we talk about in our learning community today, when we meet next, is basically what happened in our learning community Vegas. And that and the content that I share may not necessarily represent the official views of our funder. So today we'll go over the ground rules and disclaimers and isms, and we're already in that. We'll talk a little bit with each other about why cultural competence, why we want to be focusing on cultural competence, and then we'll round out the last part of our conversation today, as much as we can cover, maybe we can cover all of it, about the social determinants of health. And if you're familiar with the social determinants of health, type a Y in the chat. And if you're unfamiliar with them, type a U, just so I can get kind of a sense of where people are. And we have a little over 35 people in the learning community at this particular moment. So if we can, let's hear from everybody who can weigh in by chat. And I'm seeing that some people are familiar with social determinants of health and others are not. Great. And that's wonderful. That will give us the opportunity to have a rich conversation about the social determinants of health. So a couple of more disclaimers, and then we'll get to the ground rules and the isms. I have to admit upfront that you will not be culturally competent after completing this 4-hour training. I'm sorry, I can't stamp your certificate of attendance is that you are culturally competent. And I will say more about that as we go forward. The one thing that you can be absolutely sure of is that there will be unfinished business and unfinished and maybe unresolved thoughts or feelings after this training that will require you or give you the opportunity to look into further learning and doing a little bit of digging or research on your own. And I'm hopeful that that will be an outcome of our 4 hours together. Also, the personal truths and experience, because remember, we're a supportive learning community, you are invited to talk about your actual experience, your beliefs, your values, your thoughts. Those are our individual personal truths, and we will hopefully respect each other. Even if we don't share that particular truth, we will try to understand it, and we will certainly give it space to be communicated. And we will hopefully meet each other and express ourselves with respect. So again, and these guidelines are kind of related to some of those disclosures. Please listen to each other. And again, we want to respect and celebrate our differences. And again, also being aware of what feelings may come up for us if we experience differences or if we experience discomfort around differences. The purpose of our learning community conversation is not to ultimately be that we're all in agreement. We're all adults. We all have unique experiences, and being in agreement is not the goal. What the goal is that we actually have a substantive and a meaningful conversation that hopefully this 4 hours that we have together will be part of your journey as you move toward cultural competence. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go forward. Also, again, inviting people to speak for and from themselves. What we talk about here stays here. Again, inviting everybody to really consider making an effort to contribute as honestly and as openly as you feel is appropriate for this learning environment. And again, I'm pretty sure that at some points during this conversation, myself or anyone else in the learning community will have feelings, and you're more than welcome to talk about those. We would just ask that whatever those feelings may be, that we talk about them in a way that maintains safety for everybody and that keeps the training positive and moving forward. And again, as was said earlier, you can expect unfinished business. If anybody feels particularly uncomfortable, if there's something we need to stop and pause and look at, say ouch or type ouch in the chat, and we can stop. And you can do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself. And that may be turning your camera off, stepping away from your computer, or it may mean that maybe we need to put something on the learning community table to discuss. Also, my hope is that this conversation can also be fun, because here's a great opportunity for all of us with our unique experiences to be together in a place that is aiming to be safe and allow us to speak from our own truths. So to that end, please, no racism, sexism, ableism, ageism, sizeism, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, fat phobia, and again, we want to avoid expressing hate during this particular conversation. Now, before we go to this particular slide, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I see that several other people have activated their cameras. Very nice to see you, Rachel, and thanks for being here. And Robin as well. Very, very nice to see you. And there's Jacqueline. Excellent. Wonderful. So again, if you have a camera, please activate it if you can. If you can't, that's okay too. So folks, if you can you all agree to those particular guidelines as they're stated? You can wave, you can nod, you can type yes in the chat, you can throw money, whatever works for you. Excellent. You can do. Thanks, Kirk. Wonderful example. Thanks, Megan, of doing that digital thumbs up. Wonderful, wonderful. Good. And Erica, understand. Well, perfect. Thanks, Erica. So again, those will be the guidelines that we can always go back to as needed. All right. Now, before we look at that slide that said cultural competence, okay, I just want to open it up, and I'm wondering, perhaps Erica, if you don't mind, if I could ask you this question first, if that would be okay. Okay. I believe Erica said okay. Excellent. Okay. So Erica, thanks for doing that. You may, oh, somebody did throw money electronically. Thank you very much. And it was $4. That's a lot of money. Excellent. So Erica, the question that I have for you, and then maybe we can hear from Kirk after you, is that I made some very specific disclosures at the beginning of this conversation. And this is kind of a two-part question. Mm-hmm. So what do you think was my purpose in making those, and what was the impact of my making those at the beginning on you personally?
For me, I feel like I look at it as tone setting, and then also setting up boundaries as far as, you know, the lines to cross so that people know how to better engage within communication. Also, that you're making it a safe space. I think from the previous one, if you remember, that you're not intentionally trying to trauma bond with people. So, and like where you said that how it may hit certain areas within you. So just to make sure that it is a safe space, but to be mindful that when we are speaking, know your audience. So you were allowing your audience to know who you are.
Okay. And Erica, the second part of that, did that have any impact on you?
It did. Sometimes we're not used to people being reality based as far as sharing their person. Like you spoke a lot about like you spoke about self. And it was very transparent. So that alone, I think, was just trying to bridge the gap in this setup for people to be conscious and aware that you would like for them to share about themselves.
Thank you so much, Erica. And I really appreciate you being willing to kick that off. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah. So Kirk, would you be open to sort of sharing your reaction or answering that kind of two-part question for yourself, kind of the purpose as to why I may have made those disclosures, and if it had any kind of impact on you?
Sure, of course. The first thing is, as Erica said, you wanted to make it a safe space and set the example. Also, what I got from it is that you are even, that it's not a negative thing, because you mentioned that you're a white male, that you benefit from white male privilege. And that just is. It's not something that you created, something that you asked for, something that you wanted. It just is. And people sometimes tend to look down on people who benefit from that because they're part of the oppression in that way. And you, as again, setting the safe space and setting the example, let everybody know that, you know, this is what it is, and let's move forward from that. We won't hold it against you.
Okay. Okay. And did you have any reaction to my making those disclosures?
It kind of opened it up to be open and honest about stuff and tell the truth. Just be real. For me, that's what it brings.
Yeah, and that's what I appreciate you sharing that. Thanks so much, Kirk. Thanks. Did anybody? Yeah, please, Robin, please.
I love the word invite, because you're literally putting your arms out there and saying, I accept you as you are, I embrace you as you are, and I'm inviting you to present yourself at this table. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes complete sense. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Robin.
Mhm.
Does anybody else want to comment on your thoughts about perhaps why I made those disclosures, or what sort of impact they may have had on you personally? And if you do, you're more than welcome to unmute and share your comment, or you're also more than welcome to put it in the chat. Tyrone, would you be open to sharing any thought or any reaction that you had?
I kind of go with what Kirk was sharing. It really varies. It really does. I think a lot of it has to do with one's encounters, one's upbringing, one's philosophy, how
Sure.
they view things, and how they interpret the information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And did my making those disclosures, Tyrone, have any impact on you?
No, not at all.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks so much. I'm going to just add one other reason. And again, if anybody else wants to comment, feel free to unmute or feel free to put it in the chat. Because again, this is a learning community conversation. So one other reason,
Yeah, hello?
Hello, go ahead, Christine. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say that by you disclosing that about yourself, I feel that you leveled the playing field for you as teacher and we as learners or students, or you know, if you're looking at the counseling client type relationship, that there's no one-upmanship, if you will. And I think that's very important. You do realize the privilege of cisgender and you know, having white male privilege. I mean, these are things that are so ingrained, and sometimes people, I think, hold perhaps you, you know, as being responsible for this, and you're not. This is inbred and ingrained in for many generations, and hopefully it will be able to change as we're now recognizing that we all are on an equal playing field. I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Christine. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks for. Yeah, go ahead.
Something, Paul.
Yeah, go ahead, Tyrone, please.
You know, just from my personal experiences, I think that because I grew up in a very diverse sort of community, school, you know, and all that, and so my encounters were a lot different, and even now I still find that the privileges are equally distributed even when race is not a part, because even in Black communities, there's a certain brotherhood or sisterhood in which you fit into that allows you access from where you're trying to go. And that access is controlled too by certain groups, and not necessarily just based on race, but ideologies.
Right. Absolutely.
And so I think that if we're talking about, for me, if I'm looking at a situation and seeing if the field is leveled, I use a lot of my knowledge and experiences to ensure that the field in which I'm playing on, that I'm just able to play equally, just have access equally, regardless of, there's always going to be that hierarchy. There's always going to be a group that sort of is going to favor someone that sort of thinks or acts or moves in the same direction, went to the same college. They're going to have more access. They're going to have privilege based on that.
Yeah. You know, Tyrone, there's a word that came into my mind that you didn't say, but I thought of it as you were saying what you were saying, because it's often important to acknowledge privilege and power have a relationship. And oftentimes the people with quote unquote the most privileges actually have the most power.
Sure.
So just keeping that in mind. A couple of people wrote something in the chat. Yeah, Erica says right. A number of people have written a few things in the chat, and I just want to take a moment to read them. Erica wrote also that society has evolved with expanding and breaking new barriers on gender norms. Absolutely, Erica. And if you want to unmute and say anything about that, please do. Megan is also noting class privilege. Yeah, and that's partly, Megan, why I wanted to mention socioeconomic status and education, access to education for myself. And Jacinta writes, by being upfront with folks leaves little room for false interpretation. Folks will probably give you some credence by being upfront. Okay. And Nova writes, your sharing made me realize that I also can be open about some of my own disclosures. Thank you, Nova. Thanks for writing that. Okay. I'm going to tell you another reason, and you may, this may make sense to you. It's important for me to share those things about myself, especially during this conversation, because I know those things about myself, and I can no longer not know them. And I also know that those particular things, and again, Tyrone said this, and I thought he said it really eloquently, based on the experiences that I've had, have built me the way that I am. And I definitely have blind spots, and I have unconscious bias. So the more I can keep myself aware of that, the more likely I am to not act it out, or I'm able to acknowledge it when it sort of comes up, and then I can be responsible for it. So that's actually another reason why it's important for me to actually make those disclosures at the beginning. Megan writes, that's what I meant by socioeconomic privilege. It's a better phrase, I think. Yeah, okay, yeah. So folks, cultural competence. That's the lead title of this course. And I'm wondering, and we're going to look briefly at a definition of cultural competence, but I'm wondering if anybody has a reaction to that sort of phrase or that way of thinking, cultural competence. Because remember, like I said in the disclosures, at the end of our conversation, I'm not able to stamp a form that says, Kishana and Dwayne are now culturally competent. I can't do that. So this course is called Cultural Competence, a journey, better outcomes. So any thoughts or any reactions to the phrase or the idea? And Deborah, if you don't mind, could I invite you to comment on this? Your thoughts about cultural competence, what that actually means, or what your reaction might be to that phrase?
So cultural competence means that you are aware of what other cultures, what other people, what other populations are about, your own prejudice and why you have those, but people are different, and just being sensitive to other people's needs and culture and diverse living would make you competent and just available to open discussions and just living together.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Deborah. Any other thoughts, Megan? Any thought, any reaction to like the phrase of cultural competence, or any reaction maybe to what Deborah said? And Deborah, I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. You were saying that being familiar, being sensitive to, making space for other cultures and other communities is what makes you competent.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, go ahead, Megan.
Oh, I think maybe the first step is like what you did, which is examining and owning your own cultural background and the things that make you maybe who you are. That's a big start. And then like listening to everyone else and about what is impacting on their life and who they are.
Super. So again, I want to underline what Megan is saying, because it's the idea of starting with yourself, that cultural competence actually starts with you. And, Megan, I really love that you kind of made it very active, in the sense that you're actively examining your own self. And you're willing, and please tell me if I have this right, you're willing to be open to and listen to what other people are saying about who they are and what their experience is.
Exactly right. What I was thinking.
Okay. All right. Thank you. So
all listening and learning, I guess, to me. And
okay. So that's a third thing.
Yeah.
So let's add that.
Yeah.
Starting
listening point. And learning, meaning that you're taking it in and it starts to become part of who you are.
Yeah.
You're willing to hear it. You're willing to take it in. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much, Megan. Go ahead, Robin.
I first started in the field with drugs and alcohol back in '83, and I was working in the South Bronx, and it's all the counselors were lily white and everybody else was Black and Puerto Rican. And I remember thinking, something's wrong here. It's just not right. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't hit me where I live. And I mentioned this to some of my patients at a methadone clinic I was working at. And they were like, hey, yeah, how come we don't have more Black counselors? And I said, well, I can't answer that. But we got to be more open with each other. But we were talking '83. So back in 2002 or 2003, when they came out with Seeking Safety, and maybe a couple of years later, it was Building Bridges, Cultural Competency. I was working in White Plains, New York. And I was like, okay, everybody, let's go to this training. It's, let's go. This is great. And
what was the training, Robin?
It was Seeking Safety.
Oh, right. Seeking Safety.
And then the cultural competency part of it came, I don't know how many months later. But I was like a cheerleader trying to get the other 6 counselors. So let's go. This is great. This is great. And they were like, I don't have the time. I don't want to give up my lunches, that kind of stuff. And I just wanted to take people and shake them and say, wake up, you're working with patients. You need to know yourself before you can know your patients. You got to know your own biases. You got to know all this stuff. Well, I don't want to give up my lunch. But I'm so glad that this training has evolved to this point, because this is so important. And I'm hoping that younger counselors just coming into the field are as enthusiastic about this and are getting the word about cultural competency. Us oldsters, we're in on it, but I'm hoping that new folks coming down the pike are getting it, being enthusiastic.
Thank you, Robin. Absolutely.
Oh, by the way, let me tell you, In ASL, American Sign Language, this means enthusiastic when you rub your
Okay.
hands together. It also means Methodist, United Methodist, but hey.
So just make sure what you want to communicate at that particular moment.
Right.
Enthusiasm or United Methodist. Thanks, Robin. Several people have written a few things in the chat that I just want to read out loud. And folks, I want to just disclose, I do my best to try and, pay attention to everybody's chat. And if I miss something that you really want on the table, please just unmute and put it out there, or say, hey, Paul, you missed my chat. Back up and get that, because I'm willing to do that. Kate writes, for me, cultural competence is about being open to what I don't know. Okay. Margaret writes, Deborah writes, if this course was not mandatory for credentialing, I'm not sure people would be taking it. Interesting, Deborah. Deborah, do you want to say anything about that? That's a very interesting point. So I really would, if you can, if you can elaborate, that'd be great.
I don't. Yeah, I'm not sure if people would be taking it, because I think it's very sensitive, cultural biases and prejudice. I think people, if it wasn't mandatory, because you have to talk about your feelings and how you feel about other people and culture and family. I don't know if people would be taking it, because
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Sure. And again, that's a great question to be pondering. Natasha wrote in the chat, I'm taking it and I wasn't even aware about the credits. So we may have a whole sort of, range of why people decided to come here. And Natasha says, but she does understand your point. Yeah. Okay. Kirk is saying, so wait, this is mandatory? Say a little more about that, Kirk.
I had no idea. I'm just hearing that now. It might be. I know that OASAS requires. I didn't know it was mandatory, and
it may not be for people that are here, and for some people it may be. In fact, since Kirk, since you're kind of expressing that, and Deborah kind of brought it up, for how many people, and we have a little over 45 people in our learning community, which is fantastic today. And hopefully all 45 of you will come back for part 2. But for those of you that are here, if it was mandatory for you, if you were told that you needed to be here, type M in the chat. And if you chose to be here on your own for whatever reason, and that reason could be to get the 4 hours of credit, that's a valid reason. But if you chose to be here, type a C in the chat. Now, I have to read something that LaShawn wrote in the chat, because I don't want to miss this. LaShawn wrote, I don't think that anyone can be truly culturally competent, but we can be open to learning and becoming aware. LaShawn, do you want to elaborate on that at all? Can you unmute? Did you want to add to that?
So what I was saying when I was writing that is that it's a lot of things that happens in different cultures that we don't know, or we may not necessarily agree, but we're open to becoming aware of what they have to go through in different cultures, and the different things that may not happen here, but happen elsewhere that you may not agree. And so no one can be truly culturally competent because we don't know everything that's going on in the world. But as soon as they become something that we need to be aware of, we're open to learning about it.
Yeah, thank you. And LaShawn really makes an important point that we may not necessarily, in our journey of cultural competence, we may find that somebody has very different values than us, very different beliefs than we do. And that may cause a reaction that we have. It doesn't mean we still can't maintain being open to hearing about somebody else's beliefs and somebody else's values, even if they don't line up with ours, because that would really be communicating to somebody, you need to be just like me in order for me to feel comfortable with you. And that's not what cultural competence is about. Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
I mean, for me, and I'm always going to keep it on the eye, but in this type of arena in which we work, in order to be the best person that you can be, I believe you have to come to a realization that you have to be culturally competent if you're actually going to, for individuals who are under the license of OASAS, in order to provide the best service possible for the individuals. Just based on the fact what the young lady said before, there are so many different viewpoints and different ethnicities that we work with in the community, especially in the New York City area, that you can't understand or have, as they say, be person-centered if you're not willing to be open to what the other individuals' foundations are for what makes them who they are.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And again, it's the openness to it, the willingness to be educated by it. Okay. A lot of people typed C's in the chat. Dwayne types, and I want to make sure I read this, Dwayne, Dwayne writes, cultural competence is not a destination, it's a journey. It will always be necessary to be open and willing to learn more about each individual's unique cultural experience. Dwayne, if you don't mind, would you just unmute and elaborate a little bit on that? And especially if you could give your sense of this idea of being open and willing to learn more about each individual's unique cultural experience. Just a couple of other things in the chat that I want to acknowledge and read. Erica writes, a continuum of ongoing trainings allows us to better services our population that we serve daily. Okay, so being open to training, yeah. Natasha writes, the definition itself can also be daunting if you are not in a reflective space. Again, back to that idea of that part of cultural competence is actually looking at yourself. Now, I want to, before I go to the next slide, I want to underline something that LaShawn said, because LaShawn, you made a connection to cultural competence and being able to provide services. So what are your thoughts about that? The ability to be culturally competent, and again, many of us are considering that a process, not a destination, and how that impacts being able to provide services. And very basically stated, what's the relationship between those two? If Tatiana is culturally competent, quote unquote, or on the journey toward cultural competence, how does that impact her, and how does that impact the services, and how does that impact the clients? And if somebody can be really clear and basic about what your thoughts are about that, what do you think?
So I have a thought.
Go ahead, LaShawn.
So I think that if Tatiana is treating a client who is culturally different, they don't share the same ideologies, they don't have the same beliefs, but you can put that to the side to treat what is going on with them and have an understanding that you don't have to go through what they went through, but you have an understanding and you're willing to help them, whether you agree on the way they should go about it, because there's different ways of going about different things. And they may tell you, hey, I want to go about it this way because this is how my culture goes through that. You're being a support system to them, not to yourself. So you don't have to agree with what they're asking, but you have to be respectful and understanding.
Okay. In order to actually provide the service in a way that the person is going to be able to benefit from the service. Tyrone wrote in the chat, I think it is very important that we all start with self-care. That leads to self-awareness. That would lead to a desire to understand the various cultural encounters. Yeah, you make a great point there, Tyrone, because if we're not in a place of feeling solid and sort of secure and willing to look at ourselves because we're in a good space, we may be less open to the folks that we actually encounter. Very important connection to make.
I wanted to add something to that because
Go ahead.
a lot of times we ourselves require some healing.
Yes.
And until we get through that healing process, the desire to want to understand and to have a relationship with a variety of cultural encounters will ultimately be ineffective. And they'll sense that.
Yep. Thank you, Tyrone. Thanks for adding that. So folks, I'm going to share the next slide and just ask you to use the chat to kind of respond to this. So cultural competence, and we're thinking of that as a phrase, but now let's break it apart and think of it as two pieces, culture and competence. So I'm going to let the animation in the slide play out, but if you could put in the chat something that is part of your cultural identity. And I don't want to define that any further, but something that is part of your cultural identity. And trust your gut on this. Don't think too deeply about it, but just something that resonates for you, that's important for you, that's part of your cultural identity. Because let's face it, when we're talking about culture, we're talking about all these elements: knowledge, language, traditions and rituals, technical skills, tools and objects, arts, food. One of the things that people focus on a lot when they talk about culture is the food of that culture, or the foods, values, the relationship to the greater community. These are all elements of what make up someone's cultural identity / experience. Did somebody unmute? Does somebody want to say something? No? Okay. All right. And I see that a couple of people have put, a couple of things in the chat about their cultural identity. Yeah, and please, folks, take a moment to read these because they are generously specific to the people within our learning community, and they are really rich and generous. Yeah, okay. Natasha, understanding that traumas that do not occur from a culture or group, but rather a person, is another great place to start. Okay. My country's flag, music, and pride. Okay. My belief, collard greens on Thanksgiving. I walk between the white and Native American peoples. I don't always feel a part of either group. Thank you, Kate. Language, food, music, traditional customs, so much. Music, values. They're coming in fast and furious, which is great. And traditions, festivals and foods all day. If you're given a good chance, absolutely. Our history that may repeat itself. Food, customs, religions, spiritual, food, family, connections, music. Excellent. And again, they keep coming in. Beliefs in child rearing, music and food, celebrations, where I grew up, childhood experiences, honoring our elders, music, perfect. These are great. And again, folks, thanks for being so specific. Being from the South Bronx and being a white person did not always get the recognition that I was a South Bronxite. Okay, maybe perhaps because people were making assumptions about you, Robin. Dwayne writes, belief that it is necessary to work harder to achieve the same outcomes as my counterparts. Yes, yeah, and I've heard that many times before, Dwayne. What I was taught growing up, work ethic, wonderful. All aspects of cultural identity and that make up your unique identity. And not one of us has the same combination. Now, competence, and we think of competence, the ability to do something successfully. Competence can also be thought of as what you know. And I really want to bring that back to what people were saying about part of the process or the journey of cultural competence is knowing who you are. So what you know, and also what you think you know. So just keeping that in mind in terms of culture and competence. And the thing that really jumps out to me about this is the idea of what I think I know. And I go back to what Dwayne said earlier, that just because I had the opportunity to work with one person from this particular culture, it doesn't mean that I am now an expert in that particular culture, because the next person that may share some of that cultural identity is going to be a completely unique person. Their cultural wheel is going to be a totally different experience. I see that somebody put something in the chat, so let me just check. I had a great upbringing that encouraged me to understand that part of my cultural identity is the various encounters that have shaped my understanding to be still and listen. I am free to be vulnerable. Thanks for adding that, Tyrone. Thank you. So, keeping in mind this idea of culture, I'd like you to think about this iceberg. Now, this is sort of looking at the elements that form cultural identity from an iceberg, kind of what you see above the waterline and what's below the waterline. And I'll reference this, or I'll bring it back to some of the disclosures that I made, because just looking at me, some of the things that I disclosed would probably be pretty apparent to you, and other things may not be that I disclosed. So again, these things that are above the waterline that we can see: dress, gender, physical characteristics, eye behavior, body language, facial expressions. Sometimes we can or cannot see disability, age, race or ethnicity, or sexual identity. Sometimes we think it's what we think we know about the person based on our understanding. But again, less obvious than dress, gender, physical characteristics, eye behavior, body language, and facial expressions. So that's stuff that's above the waterline, and stuff that we might have a hunch, or we might think about the person. Okay? And that's generally, unless we're really getting to know somebody, that's generally what we go by. And we base what we see, what's above the waterline, and form impressions about that. Now, I'm going to show you the bottom part of this iceberg in just a moment. And I just want to ask, when you think of the structure of an iceberg, what is one of the things that you can really be sure of? So we just looked at what's above the waterline. So what can we be sure is below the waterline? What do you think?
A whole hell of a lot more.
I have to quote Kirk in saying that. A whole hell of a lot more. So again, those are the parts that are also really relevant to that person's cultural experience, their identity. Yes, it's much deeper than what we see in terms of that tip of the iceberg. So I'm going back to the slide. And we can't be sure. All we know is that it's going to be cold. Absolutely. So I'm going to go back to the slide. And to quote Kirk, a whole hell of a lot more. So here we go. These are all other elements And we could probably spend hours talking about these different aspects of ourselves, these deeper things, these things that are not above the waterline, that may not be able to be seen. And I want to ask a question before we proceed from this slide. If you think this is true, type a T in the chat. And if you think it's an overstatement, type an O, okay? So I'm going to say something and I'm going to ask you to decide for yourself. And don't vote yet because I haven't made the statement yet. This is the statement. Knowing some of the things below the waterline can make it possible for us to provide better services to the person we're working with. Knowing some of the things below the waterline can help us to provide better services to the person we're working with. So far, I'm getting all T's. So most people think that that's true. Natasha, what are your thoughts about why that may be true? What do you think? Natasha's in the process of unmuting. Go ahead.
So I haven't put in a T or an O yet because
What do
I'm
you
a little
think?
torn on the statement.
Great.
So I think it's helpful, maybe, but I also don't think it should be absolutely mandatory. I think that being able to look at someone and not need so much background in order to effectively serve requires that cultural competency in order to be able to say, you know, I'm not going to go into this with my own personal experience as my only backdrop. Kind of having a Shoshin or beginner's mind approach to everyone.
Yes.
That's what's making me torn about it, because I don't think you have to know all the details. I
Right.
think you just have to be accepting that there are more details.
And I love what you added, that those details won't necessarily match, and I love the word you used, your backdrop. Those details aren't going to necessarily match your backdrop. And I agree with Natasha. You don't have to know everything below the waterline. I'm not saying to you, in order to be culturally competent, you must X, Y, and Z know this. But again, you put yourself in the state of not making the assumption that this person is the same as me, and you're open to hearing about what makes up them.
Paul, can I just say, can I add something?
Of course you can. And then I see a couple of other people want to add things too. So please go ahead, Deborah.
I'm going to give you an example.
Please, yeah.
I was working with this man, and I said to him, "What is your nationality?" And he told me he was Native American. He told me the tribe he was from. And then he said, "Why did you ask me?" I said, "Because I didn't want to assume you were Latino, half Black. I don't know what you are." He said, "Because people don't ask me. They always think I'm Spanish." And then he went on to tell
above the waterline, assumption. Yep. Sorry, go ahead, Deborah. Yeah.
So then he went on to tell me about his Native American Indian and what the tribe and what he was fighting, blah, 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 blah. The whole thing, like the history, you know, and all of that. And then we started talking about his substance use. I don't think that would have ever come because he's so quiet and so mannerable. No one ever asked him anything unless, you know, this was a kidney dialysis. You know, you ready for your kidney? They never get into, he has a Latino Spanish name. So I didn't want to assume he was. So I said, "What's your nationality?" So yeah, you have to.
It's a beautiful example, Deborah. And if it's okay, can I just ask you one follow-up question? And I think this is kind of a critical follow-up question. And again, Deborah, you know, we're in our learning community together, and I know you're making I statements. You're speaking for yourself. So my question to you, if you're open to answering it, is what caused you to not make the assumption that he was Latino, given his last name, given what he looked at? What caused you to not make that assumption?
because I know that people can look any kind of way and can be any culture and come from anywhere and be different. Just because you are Black don't mean that you're American Black. You could have been brought up in the Midwest. Your culture, your behaviors, your attitudes are totally different. And I didn't want to assume, and I never assume when I'm in front of a client what they are. Never, ever. I always ask them their nationality, where they come from, where they were born. Always.
And you let them answer. Yeah. So before we go to Shakia, Jacqueline, did you put your video on and you pointed to yourself. So I'm wondering if you would be willing to elaborate on that. Because I'm wondering if people make assumptions about you.
Well, no, I get that. Just to piggyback off of the last person, I get that all the time. What's your nationality? And, I get that all the time. I get from Latino to Italian to everything.
Yeah.
But basically, I'm African American and Indian.
And that's part of your cultural identity.
Mm-hmm.
And if I'm going to have the opportunity to provide services to you, knowing that, if it's important to you, knowing that is important for me. Yeah.
Correct.
Thank you so much, Dawn.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. Go ahead, Shakia.
I just wanted to touch on when you said that, recognizing that, the patient is the same as you is important. I think recognizing that they're not the same is also important, because you don't want to kind of push what you are on the patient. You want them to have their own self and be able to verbalize their own self. And I think that when you are culturally competent, you're able to empathize with them on a different level than versus, just seeing them for who they are for face value. So that's all I wanted to share.
Yeah, Shakia, if it's okay, can I ask you just a quick follow-up question?
Sure.
So would you agree, because the way you said what you said really made me think of this, perhaps the one assumption we can make when we're providing services is that the person across from us is going to be different than us.
Okay.
Would you agree with that?
Not necessarily.
Okay, so we may have things in common, but there's still going to be things that we don't have in common.
Right. Like, okay. I can identify one way and they don't identify that way.
That's right. But you may have some other cultural connection that you share.
Exactly.
Perfect.
Agreed.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah. LaShawn, did you want to say something? And Kirk, I saw that you applauded. What were you applauding?
One thing that you could be sure of is that they're going to be different than you. That's absolutely a given.
Yeah. Yeah. And being open to the fact that they're different than me or you. Okay. Perfect. Thank you. And Robin, I've read some of what you wrote, the whole idea that people are under the pressure of having to sort of make those numbers and make the money, that it causes them to maybe skip over those details. Yeah. Okay. And I see that there's some, Erica. Okay, yes, perfect. All right, folks. So let's take a look at this next slide. We're going to move away from the iceberg for a moment. You heard it here. There's a whole hell of a lot we don't know under the waterline. So just keep that in mind. So there are a number of terms that really fall under this umbrella. And when you get this slide deck, if you're interested in going through the nuances of each one of these particular words, I encourage you, or phrases, I encourage you to do that. I'm only going to focus on the top one, which is cultural competence. And again, I want you to think about what we talked about just a moment ago about cultural competence, being that it's a journey, being that we know we don't want to impose our backdrop onto somebody else, and that we're open to those things that they may tell us that are under the waterline, and that it makes it possible for us to be effective in cross-cultural interactions. And again, based on what Kirk said just a moment ago, we can assume that every interaction we're going to have, and again, there are going to be some things we have in common, but every encounter we have is going to be a cross-cultural encounter. So just keeping that in mind too. So I'm going to share this definition of cultural competence. And then I really want to, I really would like to get your thoughts or your reactions to this one definition. But again, I really want to invite you, if you're interested, when you get the slide deck for part one, if you want to look through all of the other definitions, and you'll notice there's a tremendous amount of overlap. But again, I'm going to show you the first one, and I'd love to hear several people's reactions to this particular definition. Here we go. This is exactly what I wanted. So I'm just going to read this to you. And again, I love the image here. One size does not fit all. Cultural competence, a set of congruent behaviors, attitudes, policies, structures, and practices that come together in a system, organization, or among professionals and enable that system, organization, or those professionals to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. So I'm going to let you read it to yourself for a moment. And then I'm going to stop sharing the slide and invite you to share your reactions. And if you finished reading it, just type a Y in the chat, just so I'll know that the greater balance of folks have finished it. Okay, a couple of people have finished reading it. Take your time. Again, we're just going to spend a little bit of time talking about this particular definition. Okay, all right. I'm going to take it down. And again, if you need me to keep it a little bit longer, that's fine. I can do that too. Okay. And again, if you've read it, just type a Y in the chat so I know. All right, I'm going to go ahead and take it down, and hopefully I'm going to be able to get back. Good. So any thoughts, any reactions to paraphrase culture, responsibility, and respect for self and others? Thanks, Christine. Any other thoughts or any other reactions to that definition of cultural competence? What do you think? Yeah, go ahead, Robin.
I'm surprised at the date on that as being 1989. Because back in 1989, if somebody said to me cultural competency, I would have went, what? Right.
So the definition existed, but the practice or the understanding was not really disseminated at that point. Yeah. This is more of a verb as opposed to the adjective, in my opinion. It feels very systemic and methodical and not person-based. Very interesting, Natasha. Interesting. If you were going to craft another piece of the definition to be more person-based, what would you say?
So I've actually seen and usually associate a whole different definition.
Please.
So I actually pulled it up so I could look at the difference between the two.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I have loosely defined as the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from one's own. I feel like that is way more descriptive of what actual cultural competency is, as opposed to this definition, which to me felt more like, all right, how do we take this and put it into business practice? Not even like everyday holistic practice, but more business-centered systemic practice. That felt more, I'm trying to avoid a lawsuit, whereas the definition I read feels more like, okay, moving forward.
And individual practice. the
Right.
ability to be able to do it. And it's funny. And so thank you so much, Natasha, for adding that, because the only place that that definition gets at that is at the very end, and it says it in a very brief, kind of contracted way, the ability to be effective in cross-cultural situations. And what Natasha read really speaks to a richer or deeper understanding of that. So thanks so much for adding that. Deborah writes, it is essential to understand countertransference and transference when addressing clients. Sometimes we react to others because of our own culture and beliefs. I would go so far as to say, Deborah, that we always are interacting with other people through our own culture and our beliefs. And we want to be aware of that not becoming a barrier to being able to provide service to that particular person. Kirk, any thought, any reaction to that definition, or what Natasha said, or anybody else?
Yeah, I fully agree with Natasha. It sounds like she said it best, like trying to avoid a lawsuit. It's like, okay, we're going to act like this, when the definition that she read speaks to it's more individualized and on both parts, on the person being competent and on the, I guess, what would be the client or patient at that time, to understand, not as a system, but to understand them individually.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I'll tell you, Kirk, you made me think that if, like, I was new at an organization and somebody said, you know, we're all on a journey together toward cultural competence, and they shared the definition that was on that slide, I would be sort of like, okay, it sounds to me like you're talking more about the program or the organization. And if they shared Natasha, and they're talking about the organization, they're talking about the program. But if they shared Natasha's definition, I would be much more like, oh, I know what I'm shooting for
me,
now.
Yeah, for me.
Yep.
For me, yeah.
Yep. Yep. I know what sort of the shape of what I'm trying to do is. Okay. Excellent. Natasha writes, the ability to understand, appreciate, and interact with people from cultures or belief systems different from one's own, which goes back to what Meg said earlier about needing to be aware of our culture and our beliefs so that we can discern the difference. So I go back to that idea that cultural competence starts with us, and that self-reflection, that self-awareness. Yeah, I see Natasha nodding her head. Yes. Okay, super. So I'm going to share the next slide. Did somebody just unmute? Did somebody want to say something? Oh, okay. Just want to make sure, give you the opportunity to do that if you want. And I'm just going to check the chat. Yep, excellent. Shakia writes, I think we need to merge the two definitions together as it requires both the program and the individual recognition order for cultural competency to be effective. And Shakira is making a great point that if all the individuals in the organization are kind of on board and are on that journey toward cultural competence, but the program isn't, or the organization as a whole isn't, there are going to be problems. So I like your suggestion of combining the two. I just wanted to share this sort of continuum perspective of the journey toward cultural competence. And again, the journey, you'll notice there's no end point. That's an arrow at the end, and it keeps moving toward being culturally proficient, able to respect other people's cultural beliefs and identities, and know that we don't want to impose our own in that. And you'll see the two ends of this spectrum as the line sort of shows it: cultural destructiveness and cultural proficiency. Again, we want to move through. And I also want to touch on cultural blindness. So I'm going to briefly stop sharing my screen for a moment, and I'm going to say something that I'd like you to share your reactions to. Because remember, we're looking at that continuum, right? And in the middle, there is cultural blindness. Okay? So let's say you're a supervisor and your supervisee says to you, you know, I don't see color. I treat everybody that Natasha just almost had a heart attack. I'll say it again, but I'll say it more gently, hopefully. The staff person says to you, I don't see color. I treat everybody that I work with the same. So I'm wondering, does anybody have any thought or any reaction to that statement?
That's a problem. My reaction is that's a problem.
And Kirk, can you elaborate a bit as to why?
Because let me see how I can put this. It puts everybody in the same place. You're not recognizing differences. You don't notice differences, and you will treat people the same when everybody is not to be treated the same. We're all different. We all have different cultures, different backgrounds, different colors, different upbringing, different everything. And when you say, I don't see color, to me, that's a problem.
Okay. Kirk, can I ask you just a quick follow-up question? And it's a personal question.
Sure.
And you can decline to answer it, okay? I'm wondering if you can imagine if you were seeking services and you were sitting across from a worker and a worker said to you, you know, Kirk, I just want you to know, I don't see color and I treat everybody the same. Margaret shaking her head no. The question that I'm just asking is, what do you imagine would be your personal reaction to that?
I'd probably get up and leave.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, I did, just because there's not going to be a discussion. I'm not going to educate this person at this time on
right.
how and why. So
okay.
I've lost. I'd probably leave.
Okay. Thank you. And thanks. Yeah, Robin wants to say something. Go ahead, Robin. Thank you, Kirk. Thanks.
My supervisor in White Plains, which is Westchester County, New York, was a Black man. And he said to me, you don't have to go to any trainings. You don't have to ask other counselors to go to other trainings with you and take them out of the office, because you just treat everybody the same. You don't see Black, you don't see Puerto Rican, you don't see any color. And I just looked at him, and I'm one of those unfortunate people that my face tells everything. I can't stop my face. And I said,
don't ever play poker, Robin.
But he's my supervisor. I said to him, so you don't want any of us to be self-aware, eh? He said, well, I'm not saying that. I said, so it's just that you're not self-aware and you don't want anybody else to be. And he said, you know what? I can't deal with you right now. You're too much all the time. It was my supervisor. He didn't want us to go to trainings because it cost money.
And in addition to it costing money, he also didn't believe there was any benefit in it.
Oh, no, there's no benefit. No.
And
just
again,
everybody the same.
Right. And again, I really love the way Kirk said it. Everybody is not the same.
That's right.
Everybody has different needs.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So I just want to read a couple of things that people put in the chat. Dwayne, I really want to read what you said because I thought that Dwayne said, condescending statement, ... disbelief. Yeah. And tell me if you think I'm overstating this. And I bet your supervisee thinks that's the right way to go. I would venture to guess that the supervisee thinks I'm doing a good job because of that. I think Margaret wants to say something. Go ahead, Margaret.
For me personally, if someone was to say, I don't see color, the first thing I would think is they see color. Okay, that's the first thing that would come to my mind.
Yeah.
I know me personally, I get it. I speak fluent Spanish. My family half comes from Italy, half comes from Ireland. people totally assume because I speak Spanish that I am Hispanic. I'm the only one in my facility that speaks Spanish. I get all the Spanish speaking clients, and they all just assume that I'm Hispanic. And so I always have to tell them, no, I'm not, you know, so.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. And you know, the one thing we can bank on is that if you were sitting across from Deborah, Deborah wouldn't make that assumption. She would ask you what your cultural background was, because she wants to understand you in order to be able to provide services to you. Am I right about that, Deborah? Okay, all right. So Natasha says, I would leave faster if they didn't look like me. If they looked like me and said that to you, you'd leave faster, okay? LaShawn says, I am not them and they are not me. Absolutely. And again, if you boil it all down, folks, keeping it really simple, that's what cultural competence is saying, that I am not them and I'm willing to be aware of who I am and they are not me. And I'm open to finding out who they are and learning from that. Deborah, do you want to add something? No, you sure? You look like you're on the edge of adding something.
No, I'm fine.
Okay, all right, just wanted to check, All right, so folks, I'm going to share my screen again. And again, keep in mind that continuum and that cultural blindness is right in the middle. And again, people can move from cultural destructiveness, incapacity, blindness. I love pre-competence because it's almost like pre-contemplation, and then competence, and again, that continued journey toward proficiency. So there are some specific benefits that clients can experience, and I'm just going to share this list with you, and I'm just going to ask, and you're more than welcome to unmute or you can put it in the chat, but I'm just going to ask if you think that there's something, a benefit that a client could experience from an organization, a program, and a staff that is on the journey toward cultural competence. So if you think this list is incomplete and there's something you'd add, unmute or put it in the chat. Access to services, a greater sense of safety, an understanding of the impact of their culture and trauma, language accessibility, thinking of what Margaret said just a moment ago. Their human rights and values are heard, recognized, respected, and included in their service plans. So before we go to that, is there anything, can you think of any other benefits that the client might experience if the organization, the program, and the staff are working together and they're on that journey toward cultural competence? Is there anything you'd add? Would you agree that everything that on that inclusion, yeah, thanks, Kirk, they can be vulnerable, thank you, Deborah. Yeah, so those could definitely be added to that list. Okay, anything else that anybody wants to add? Again, benefits you think the client would get from that situation. Okay.
More of a sense of trust.
Yes.
A
More
feeling
of a
that,
sense, yeah,
you know,
and probably,
I can
yeah, go ahead,
trust,
Robin. Yeah, go ahead.
that I can perhaps step over that murky line of trusting this person and the persons he or she works for on my behalf.
Okay.
I might feel more able to tell you my secret stuff or what I deem secret, because there's a, I think I can do this. I think it's going to be safe.
Or who you are and what's important to you. Yeah. Thank you. Thanks so much, Robin. Christine, self-importance rather than intimidation, longevity and staying ability, completion of the program. Yeah. So there's a possibility that people would be retained more effectively and be able to complete the program. Okay, I'm going to show you another list. And then I have something I'm going to ask you to completely populate on your own. But here's another list to consider. Now, these are some of the things that the organization can get out of being culturally competent. And I'm going to let you just look at this list and ask you if any of them on the list particularly jump out to you. So if anything on this list jumps out to you, feel free to unmute or put it in the chat. And it can jump out to you because you agree wholeheartedly, or it can jump out to you for any other reason as well. But if it jumps out, perfect. So here are 9 things that can be potential benefits for the organization. And again, if you want to just say like number 6 jumps out to me, or number 4 jumps out to me, or you can put it in the chat. So any of them that jump out to you that can be benefits to the organization. And again, there's no right or wrong here. It's just if any of them in particular stand out to you. Okay,
Could you speak a bit more on number 2?
Sure. Hold on just a second. So Ms. Sewell says 5, Kirk says 8. Yeah, and let me go back. And Robin, was that you?
Could you speak a bit more on number 2?
Number 2. And is that you, Robin?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, good. I can't see you right now. All I can see is the slide.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so the organizational infrastructure, because it's open to the idea of diversity and diverse ideas, it's possible that there can be more openness about where they seek resources and how those resources actually bolster a stronger infrastructure that holds the programs and the staff. That's my understanding of it. I open the floor to anybody who wants to add anything to that or have another thought about what a positive effect on infrastructure means. Robin, what's your thought to my explanation?
You're on the money there.
Okay.
I have a bigger question that probably is not for this moment, maybe for next time, but
okay.
What do you do if you are in a place like I was with a supervisor who, doesn't believe in
cultural competence?
Yeah, and it's like, just treat everybody the same. You don't need to take counselors out from work and have them go take a course.
Yeah.
And it was, I remember walking out of the office that day, and it's like, oh my God. Oh.
Yeah. That really left you with a very disturbed, painful feeling.
Disillusioned.
Yeah.
And pretty, I was kind of pissed off too, to be honest with you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. A number of people have noted number 8, an informed understanding of needs. And I'm going to underline, as some of our colleagues said earlier, that individual person's needs. So then the program can actually be more effective because they're meeting actual people's needs, which can help to retain people in services. Now, as we go forward, I want to share this list. Now, what do you think could be the benefits to the provider? And that means you. So if you're in a context, and Robin, this is really appropriate to the question that you just asked, like, what do you do if you're not in a context? But if you're in a context where your organization, your program, your colleagues are engaged in this journey toward cultural competence, i.e. the journey. Cultural competence is really aspirational. We never get there because no two people are the same. But if everybody's willing to be on that journey, and we know that journey starts with ourselves, what do you think some of the benefits to the provider are? Now, you'll see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's nothing written there because I want to get a sense from you. What do you think are the benefits to the provider of being in that particular context? And let's see if we can get 5, and maybe we can get more, but let's see if we can at least get 5. What do you think are the benefits to the provider?
Retention.
Okay, so the provider stays in, there's almost a parallel process there, Robin. The provider also stays in the position, okay? Yeah, any other thoughts? Benefits to the provider. We looked at it from the client perspective. We looked at it from the organizational perspective. Now we're looking at it from the provider. And so far on the table, we have retention. What do you think? Christine writes, being open-minded with room for growth and relevance. Excellent. Thank you. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Margaret. Margaret, did you want to add something? Benefit to the provider? No? Okay. Any, yeah, go ahead, Robin. And you're got another one?
Word's going to get out on the street. My clients were always talking to each other and saying, you know, this is a better program because X, Y, and Z. So people will start talking about it and you'll get more folks coming in or being more unafraid to come in for services.
Okay. And again, you're framing that as that's a benefit to the worker.
Yeah, it's benefit to the whole clinic, to everybody who's engaged.
Yep. Absolutely. Okay. Jacinta writes, continuity of care, contact, and as what was mentioned earlier, trusting the service. I'll throw out one that just popped into my head based on what Jacinta said, which is the idea of the people receiving the services are working as collaborative partners, as opposed to people that have to be tracked down, made to do whatever they're doing. They actually will collaborate with the worker. If you're okay with that, I'll throw that one on the table. Kate writes, less stress for the provider, not working against the grain. Individualized treatment is always easier to provide. Kirk writes ROI. Kirk, what does that stand for? I'm missing, I have a text deficiency. Go ahead.
Well, no, it's actually a business acumen. It's return on investment. It's you've invested time to make sure that the people get what they want. It's going to pay off in all the ways that everybody's mentioning with patients and satisfaction and word of mouth and all that stuff. So you're going to get a return on what you invested in.
Super.
So ROI is return on investment.
Yep, thank you. I'm going to write that down in my book of things I learned today. Excellent. Thank you. So folks, the last thing that I'd really like us to do today, Deborah writes, willingness to learn, opportunities for personal and professional growth. Yeah, people want to be in a job where they're growing personally and professionally. So being on that journey can provide that opportunity. So I have one other thing that I'd like to share with you today. It's a video. I'd like to share it with you, and I'd be very open to your thoughts and your reactions to this. And we can move the social determinants of health to the next part of our conversation, because I want to make sure we touch on those. So Jacinta writes, that's very true. They participate willingly, easy relationship building on both parts. Yes, yeah, absolutely. So if you're familiar with who Mary T. Bassett is, type a Y in the chat. And if you're unfamiliar with who she is, type a U. So if you know who Mary T. Bassett is, unfamiliar, okay, yeah, unfamiliar, okay. Unfamiliar, yeah, that's fine. Unfamiliar, I was unfamiliar until recently myself. So it's understandable. Okay, is there anybody who does know who Mary T. Bassett is and would be willing to unmute and share what they know? Okay. And some of you may be Googling who it is right now. And that's what Kirk's doing. All right. So, and that's fine. But Ms. Bassett is a medical provider, as an MD, as well as having a master's in public health. And she is currently the Commissioner of Health for New York State. And she's fairly new in her job. I had the opportunity to listen to remarks that she was making to a panel that was going to talk about racism as being a public health problem. And some of her remarks really jumped out at me because she starts by drawing a parallel between HIV/AIDS and COVID and the communities that were impacted more intensely with both of those pandemics. So I just want to share these remarks with you, and then we'll conclude our conversation today with your thoughts, your reactions to these particular remarks. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Virus, HIV. I originally saw my role there, not as a public health practitioner, but as a clinician. I was there to deliver technical skills. However, as was true in the United States, individuals who were most likely to acquire HIV and later die of AIDS were those who were socially marginalized and underserved. The tools we used to prevent HIV/AIDS as health professionals were condom demonstrations, education, urging people to change their individual behaviors. These were somewhat comparable to what we did in the early days of COVID-19. Wear a mask, avoid crowds, stay home. However, in both cases, in the case of COVID and of HIV, new cases continued to climb. And they would not climb equally across society. Since this experience with HIV in Zimbabwe, a cornerstone of my working life has been recognizing and calling out structural racism and other systemic factors that affect health. I think a simple and straightforward definition of racism is racial prejudice backed by power and resources. Definition attributed to Fagan back in 1994. I and colleagues have created a taxonomy of racism, and we break it down into 4 different categories. There's internalized racism. This refers to the ways in which all of us in our society internalize ideas about race. The fact that each of us can probably declare what race we are assigned to has more to do with our society than our biology. And we also may internalize ideas of inferiority or superiority. So that's internalized racism. Then there's interpersonal racism, which is what probably most of us think about when we think about racism. This is prejudiced behavior between individuals, either based on explicit, articulated prejudices or implicit biases, beliefs that we have that we may not even be aware that we have. Then comes institutional racism, and that's, refers to the ways in which institutions replicate societal beliefs about race and ethnicity. And then a phrase which we are all using much more these days, structural racism, which I really view as the platform on which all the other forms of racism are produced and reproduced. And it is the structure that means that racism is not simply a matter of us as individuals, but is a societal challenge on which we must all work.
Had anyone seen that before? No? Okay. So any thoughts, any reactions to her remarks? What do you think? And again, you're more than welcome to unmute, or if you want to put something in the chat, that's great. Yeah, not uncommon statement. Thanks, LaShawn. Excellent.
I like
Yeah,
that
go
she
ahead, Robin.
started out small, internalized, then interpersonal, then institutional, then structural. Yeah, I like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Don't
I
like
think
to generalize, but the truth is the truth. Thank you, Ms. Sewell. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Natasha.
I think your personal background is going to give you different perspective on what she said. I agree with Robin that I do like the way she kind of started on a smaller scale and went up as opposed to kind of point down, so top down, the way most businesses are structured. So I think that opened up that avenue for conversation and the comparison. But again, I think this is where understanding your own cultural, even racial, social class bias is important, because everyone's going to take something different from it, right? So someone who is a marginalized group is going to take that very differently than someone who couldn't relate to that at all.
Mm-hmm. Natasha, if it's okay, can I ask you a follow-up question?
Sure.
So I really, the essence of what you're talking about is really the essence of cultural competence, because we really want to understand how the person who's taking that in is reacting to it. And you're making such a crystal clear point, is that depending on where you sit, you're going to react to that very differently. So if it's okay, would you be willing to say sort of how it hits you or how you react to it?
So as I was listening to it, you know, I thought about where I live and being in a marginalized community, how COVID did directly affect us in a very different way, and all the people who I know who lost people or had to make, I think, more drastic adjustments than maybe other demographics would have had to or had to, excuse me. But I think that she did a really good job of not overstating and overgeneralizing and kind of making it an interdependent conversation. So being part of a larger scale. But again, for me personally, it was definitely a different way of looking at it. And, you know, when she said, you know, things specifically about race and how it's a social construct as opposed to, you know, something that, because we're not, I mean, we chose to start identifying people by race, just like humans decided time. And then we now hold time as like this end all be all. I have to be on time. Everything's on a schedule. We created time. So we created our own monster. And so, you know, listening to that statement kind of put a highlight on that fact, put a highlight on those differences.
Thank you. Thanks. And, you know, Natasha, as you were talking, it really made me think too, this idea of creating that monster, because whiteness was created. Mm-hmm. Whiteness didn't exist, but it was created. And tell me, Natasha, if you agree with this, it was created as a way to secure and attain power and privilege.
I would say yes, and then I'll take that a step deeper.
Please.
Whiteness was created to also create elitism. And as soon as they created whiteness, they had to create everyone elseness to kind of justify that. So it was, okay, we made whiteness, but that's not enough because that doesn't separate us enough. So now we have to give everyone else a different identity to show you how you're not like the one thing we created. So it became a trickle down effect that no one asked for.
Yeah, and to show you what degree or lack thereof of power you have.
Exactly.
Within the structure that we created.
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
No problem.
Thanks. So, Deborah, did you want to unmute?
No, I was just, what I did like what she said was that race has more of a society. Race has more to do with society than biology. And I thought about, so I was getting ready to write something that social economical status is what really separates it. When you talk about, it's not really so much the race, it's your social economical status is where you will be and who you are and what you have. And that has a whole different dynamics.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks. Thanks so much, Deborah. Any other thoughts, any other reactions to her remarks? And again, I really appreciate the important point that Natasha made about depending on where you sit is going to really have an impact on your thought or your reaction to those particular remarks.
Yeah,
Any
I
other
agree.
thoughts? Yeah, go ahead, Christine, please.
Yeah, I totally agree with the last two people that spoke, and what Natasha said is very important, I believe. What Dr. Bassett said, I'm going back to the HIV/AIDS pandemic when it happened in the 80s, and how any new condition, a human condition, when it comes out, is always marginalized. There's always the point of the finger of blame towards one population or another. And I think we're so willing to get on that bandwagon in so many instances that by the time it finally expands to the rest of the population and to people at large, we're already indoctrinated into the wrongness of the situation. And I think that needs to happen from the top on down, you know, the medical community, the psychiatric community, the therapeutic community, and eventually maybe it'll get to, you know, the little people, us, and then maybe we can go forward and work in some sort of an organized human way. Thanks for letting me share that.
Of course. Thank you, Christine. Thanks for bringing that to the table. And I just want to read, Deborah added, socioeconomic status separates us more than race today. And Jacinta wrote, I see MLK's picture in the background. Yes, I saw that too. I also saw in the background the scales of justice were behind her as well. So that picture was clearly intentional. Kirk, any thoughts, any reactions to what Dr. Bassett said?
I do, but I'm gonna withhold comment at this time.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. And maybe when and if there is a time that you want to put it on the table, that's entirely up to you. Thank you. Thanks. Anything else that anybody would like to add in regard to those remarks or that video? Okay. Well, we are about at having 5 minutes left to our time together today. I don't know about you, but for me, it felt like it went by pretty fast. I don't know if you had that experience, but it felt to me like it went by pretty fast. So what I'm going to ask to do sort of in the last few minutes that we have, and I'll invite anybody who would like to do this to either, you can do it in the chat or you can unmute and say a few words. We've had about 2 hours together in this learning community, and we focused a little bit about why cultural competence, the benefits of cultural competence to clients, organizations, and to providers. We also started to unpack a little bit about racism and the structure of racism. And again, I agree with Natasha. I like the fact that Dr. Bassett starts with internalized racism that all of us have experienced and sort of builds that and the relationship up to structural racism. So what I'm going to ask people, anyone who wants to, based on our time together, based on this conversation, what's one thing you take away with you? What's one thing you take away from our time as a learning community together? I think Deborah's about to type something in the, no, she's not about to type something. All right. So I'm just going to ask people to think about that for a minute, and you're more than welcome to type it in the chat, or if you'd like, you're more than welcome to unmute.
I have 3 choices, and of course I picked the wrong first 2 choices. Okay. I think I was going to comment on the statement that I wrote about cultural competency not being a destination, but being a journey. And I say that from my experience in working with the New York State Office of Mental Health for the past 43 years. It is something that it is a subject that is brought up to us every single year, cultural competency, and we certainly have to take training to quote unquote be more cultural competent. And for me, there's never going to be a way to provide a stamp and say that a person is cultural competence. Cultural competency is the ability to, and the willingness to be open enough to learn, to adjust to each individual's cultural circumstances.
Yeah.
And we learn from that. And I think that's what makes us at least cultural competent.
Thank you so much, Dwayne. And is there anything in particular you take away from our time together today?
What I take away from it is that I think this is a conversation that has to be ongoing. It seems like every time there's some kind of live interaction, no kind of opportunity, there's just more to learn each and every time. The trainings that I was talking about were they were videos, and you just, you go through them and you learn facts, but you also just answer questions at the end.
Yeah.
But the interactional aspect of learning about cultural competency, there's just no way to replace that.
Thank you. Thanks so much. A couple of people have written some things in the chat. I just want to share those. What stood out to me, okay, so that's what Deborah put about that race has more to do with our society than biology. Christine writes, as a provider, never lose the ability to learn and grow in every capacity. Knowledge is power. I studied Latin for 4 years, and there's a phrase, scientia est potentia, and that means knowledge is power. Very informative training. I think anyone working in social services field needs to take this training. Paris, always informative. Thank you again. You're welcome, Paris. Always glad to have you in the learning community. Deborah, it was quite interactive and refreshing. Natasha, great interaction, everyone. I am loving the space that we are creating for growth. Thank you for adding that, Natasha. Tara writes, we're all different and unique. Being culturally aware means continuing to try to understand another person's culture and experiences, and cultural competence is necessary to be a more effective clinician and understanding human being. Jacinta, we need more of this type of training to woke folks to understand that we are diverse people who need to be understood without prejudices, not to prejudge the entire race with the behavior of some bad apples. Dawn writes, great awareness. Nova, thank you, Paul. Expanded my horizons some more. Kirk, the iceberg is real, and you've created a platform for expressing our feelings. Wonderful. Thank you so much, folks. Jacinta writes, great training as usual. Thanks. You're welcome, Jacinta. Thank you. So, folks, again, I want to thank you. I really look forward to our next conversation, part 2. Please have a great afternoon, and I'll look forward to seeing you in part 2. Thanks so much, everybody.